Aloha, everybody, and welcome. I'm Natalie, and this is Life After a Cult, the channel where we expose cult nonsense, we laugh at the absurdity, and hopefully we unbrainwash ourselves in the process. Today, we're exposing some next level nonsense. Imagine a city deciding to celebrate the release of Dianetics, or worse, declaring an actual L. Ron Hubbard Day. Well, it does happen. And my guest today, they tried to do it in his town and he was not having it. We're going to be talking with Jordan Horan, a psychologist and educator who stood up at the Portage City Council meeting in Michigan and called out Scientology and Dianetics for what it is, which is a danger to mental health. And Jordan isn't just some random guy with opinions. He is a legitimate mental health professional specializing in psychological evaluations. He literally teaches a course on the topic and even writes for the Michigan Psychologist. He knows exactly why Scientology's pseudo-therapy is harmful, and he's going to be here to help us break it all down. Thank you, moderators, for being here and helping out. Members, I see you. Everybody in the live chat, welcome. If you have questions as we go along, if you put question in front of it, I'll keep an eye on those and we'll try to get to as many of them as we can. I'd like you all to welcome here. Welcome, Jordan. And is it pronounced Horan? I should have asked you real quick.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep, you got it. Thank you for having me on.
I'm so glad you're here. And for anyone joining us who might not know, there was a city council meeting in Portage City, Michigan, where Scientology was trying to get through a proclamation to make it L. Ron Hubbard Day on March 13th, which is his birthday. Well, this city council wasn't going all in on the proclamation as it stood because it was pretty much like all hail L. Ron Hubbard in it. They did bring it down. But the interesting thing is, and I don't know if you know this, Jordan, the final proclamation was recognizing that Dianetics, the Modern Science of Mental Health, was published, that it's the anniversary of the release of the book on March 13th, but it's not. March 13th is L. Ron Hubbard's birthday. The anniversary of Dianetics is May 9th. So Scientology is just like looking a fool left and right. Let's start out with, can you tell people, I mean, I kind of gave a little bit of information, but just a little bit about your background so people understand kind of where you're coming from.
Yeah, no, great question. I'm a master's degree level psychologist. In the state of Michigan, we're called limited licensed psychologists. So that means I'm supervised by a doctoral level psychologist, but I still do all my practice. I just have to have a licensed psychologist sign off on my reports and stuff. It's a form of like supervision. And so, you know, I specialize in psychological evaluations, like you said, primarily with what we call neurodevelopmental disorders. So like autism spectrum disorder and attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, some learning disorder stuff. Those are like my bread and butter, if you will. But I do evaluations for other mental health concerns as well, anxiety, depression, personality disorders, all that kind of stuff.
Sure.
I also do some therapy, but specialize mostly in the diagnostics, if you will. And I also teach, like you said. So I love teaching. I love science. I love educating people about the science of psychology. I think some of my students are probably here because I told them about it. And I told them I'd give them extra credit if they showed up.
Nice.
And they have to write.
Your students do not get extra credit unless they hit the like button and subscribe.
Okay, fair enough. You all heard it from Natalie, so that is part of the requirements. And then they have to do a reflection paper. So good. And so yeah, I've always cared about helping people. I want to help people, and one of the ways that we can help people is through science, through reasoning and those kind of things. And there's a lot of pseudoscience in psychology. So I'm consistently like thinking about and confronting stuff that occurs among other mental health professionals. And I'm trying to do my part to help other people think clearly.
Sure.
And Yeah. So
Yeah.
I could be tangential as well. So cut me off and redirect me, please.
Let me ask you this. How did you find out about the proclamation that the city of Portage was trying to push through, having to do with Scientology? How did you find out? Walk us through kind of what happened there.
Honestly, it was happenstance. So I I was telling my students, they were making fun of me because I said the first thing I do when I wake up is I turn on my phone and like I've got this Google feed where it shows like news articles and stuff that's like moderated to me.
Sure.
And I was scrolling through and I saw a headline from Wood TV 8, which was one of the local news stations, and it said something about, you know, Portage Proclamation of L. Ron Hubbard's books. I was like, wow, that's really like messed. Like, what is going on? So I clicked on it, and then I started reading through this write-up that had been only published a few hours before, kind of talking about the proclamation. The official proclamation that was read was either the second or third version. So they had changed some of the language. The city council tried to talk back and walk back some of the original stuff that I believe they wanted to say. So really, it was just kind of happenstance.
Yeah, you saw it. When you saw it, what was your reaction? What spurred you to like, oh, no, I need to go say something about this?
Well, I started reading the proclamation, and anytime someone uses the term mental health, I automatically am like, okay, they need to be talking about like the science of mental health, and like, because this is clearly an important thing that has to do with human well-being. So I like started reading the proclamation, and I was aware of Scientology. I'm like, I think I'd seen a documentary years ago, you know, about like the Sea Org, and then I'd done some digging. I'm like, yeah, the L. Ron Hubbard guy, he's the dude that the science fiction writer. And then I was like, oh yeah, like he thought, you know, the Galactic Confederacy and all this kind of stuff. And I was like, if the city council is going to recognize and treat this as what this guy has to say with no training in mental health or whatever, and they're going to like recognize and give credence. I think I used that term in when I talked to the city council there, and I'm like, you guys are legitimizing pseudoscience. Like, this is a problem, especially in 2025 with all the misinformation. So I was basically heated, is what I'm saying. I was activated, and I was like, I've got to try and do something.
Yeah, and we loved it. We played your clip a few times. I've done a couple of videos about this, and there were other people who spoke up as well. And I was so amazed at the passion, because as a former member, you know, I have my story and that of my family, and I am so blown away by how many people never in Scientology, but all in unending this cult, are just lending their voices and their passion and their time to expose this. When you spoke at the city council, you talked about it being a pseudoscience.
Mm-hmm.
And can you talk a little bit about you know, what would qualify as this? What makes something a pseudoscience versus not a pseudoscience? So for example, why is it that Dianetics, how would you explain why it's a pseudoscience?
That's a fantastic question. And again, we could get extremely philosophical. We won't do, because a lot of people, a lot of philosophers of science have spent a long time trying to figure this out. Actually, this is one of my favorite books. I don't know if you can see it. It's Philosophy of Pseudoscience, Reconsidering the Demarcation Problem. It's edited by one of my intellectual heroes, Massimo Pigliucci, and Martine Baudry, I believe is his name. So in general, there is no hard line. It's more of, you have to look for a constellation of features. It's almost like if you're diagnosing a disorder, if you will. So, you know, what I teach my students and what we talk about a lot is looking out for characteristics or warning signs of pseudoscience. So for example, you know, one warning sign of pseudoscience is jargon. And one of the things that Scientology appears to do incredibly well, and Hubbard was amazing for this, just creating all these crazy terms that are really, it's like, what is he talking about? Kind of creating that confusion, right? Like clear, engrams, thean or whatever, the THE,
Thetans.
Thetans. Yeah.
Which is the soul, the individual. In Scientology, it's what they call the spirit or the soul.
Yeah. So instead of just saying spirit or soul, they're like, oh, we'll call it Thetans. So when people are starting to use a lot of jargon and they can't clearly define it, right? Because like I'm reading through, I'm like, just call it a soul. We already have a word for it. Just say like, oh, the person's soul, right? So that's one characteristic. Another characteristic is a lack of peer review. Science is a human enterprise, so there are limitations, and we can talk more about that too. So some of the distrust and problems in science, there's some credence to that because we're humans, we're fallible. But the problem is a lack of peer review, a lack of outside experts checking your work. It's like, being in school and sometimes you'd hand your paper off to someone else for them to grade, right? So science operates by having other experts check our work. So for example, let's say that I propose a new psychotherapy and I say, oh, we're going to call it Jordan's bestest psychotherapy. Well, the scientific community would be like, okay, now you have to publish a study, you have to submit the manuscript, and we're going to review it. That has not happened. I believe in the early 50s, there was either only one or two peer-reviewed studies. They weren't like strong studies, but looking at some of the Dianetic techniques. If you don't have peer review, if you're saying that you're a science and other people aren't checking your work, that is a strong indicator that something is a pseudoscience. People need to hold us accountable. I'll belabor on this point a little bit more because it is really important. I think it's often misunderstood. For example, I am a reviewer for the psychology journal called Current Psychology. So what happens, and my students know this because I brought them in, I showed them manuscripts that I had reviewed. Scientists will submit a manuscript, an editor will receive it, and he will disperse it to content experts. So me, autism. So I review a lot of scientific studies regarding autism. And so then what I do is I review it, I provide comments, and you go through this like iterative process sometimes. The last article that I reviewed, I think we went through 3 or 4 rounds before I personally, on my end, I said that it was good enough to be published at that point. So science is a very rigorous, laborious process. And to get something published takes years. So for example, some of the studies that I've been a part of that have been published, we did those studies like a year or 2 ago. Again, peer review is incredibly important to people to check your work. L. Ron Hubbard just said, I got some ideas. I'm going to write it down. Here's my book.
Yeah, that is pretty much what happened. Were you, I mean, it's interesting because of your background and what you do. And now I understand more why, when you saw that, you were just like, no, I need to, say something about that. Do you have any questions off the bat about Scientology or Dianetics? Because I think it's kind of cool because I have questions for you, but I want you to feel, you to ask your questions as well, especially knowing that your students are watching. It'd probably be a good opportunity for them to also understand why former members and people who are critical of Scientology, why, it's easy to say, oh, it's a family destroying human trafficking cult, but why?
Yeah, no, that's great. I do have a lot of questions. But before we started, one of them that, that struck me is like, when did you realize like L. Ron Hubbard was a science fiction writer, right? Like when were you aware of that? And like, what were some of the explicit messages that you were told about mental health while you were in?
That's a great question. I remember always knowing that, well, in the 80s, sometime in the late 80s, when I started reading some of L. Ron Hubbard's science fiction, Battlefield Earth, and the Mission Earth series, which I read while I was a member of the Sea Organization, which is their paramilitary branch where you sign a billion-year contract because you're supposed to come back lifetime after lifetime, working for less than $47 a week to expand Scientology. And we were allowed to read L. Ron Hubbard's science fiction work. In Scientology, there are everyday Scientologists that do services in Scientology. They live in their own homes. They go about their lives. They tend to experience a lot of financial abuse or pressures to, give up their teenagers to join Scientology staff. Then there's Scientology staff members, like at Battle Creek. There's an organization there, I believe. You sign a 2.5 or a 5-year contract to become a Scientology staff member. You're still living in your own home, but you have up to 3 required roll calls a day. They say that you're a religious worker, but you have to sign a contract and you have to be there or you get in trouble. And it is a full-time job, but they get around that. A lot of this Scientology gets away with because of their religious status and the status they got from the IRS.
Yep.
Then you have the Sea Organization, which is where you signed a billion-year contract. You're working 7 days a week for Scientology. There's no time off. If you're lucky, you can get a day here and there, but you're working holidays, everything. That's where a lot of the abuse occurs in the Sea Organization because it's so easy to hide it because there's not a lot of interaction with the outside world. And in Scientology, what happens is they want to keep you with your blinders on and they want you to live in this echo chamber. And so if there's a dentist who is a Scientologist, of course you're going to see them. You're going to marry a Scientologist or get your partner in. A lot of people get in through relationships. So growing up in Scientology, or those of us who grew up in Scientology, have a little bit of a different experience than someone who gets in as an adult. And in my opinion, it's primarily because we had no other way to think. When I left Scientology, I was 40 years old. I'm 54 now. And I would hear, well, you just got to kind of like remember who you were before the cult. And I'm like, I was a very young child there. I don't know.
Yes.
Working through that's still something that I feel like I do still today. And it does seem that in Scientology, people have their breaking point happens at different points. L. Ron Hubbard being a science fiction writer is generally not a problem for anybody in Scientology because the way it's presented to us is, he was a science fiction writer to fund his research. So he made all this money in science fiction so he could research Dianetics and Scientology.
Nice.
And even though within Scientology, you have your own, whether it's financial abuse, physical, otherwise, covering up SA, all of those things, but you're not allowed to talk about it. So you're not allowed to speak about your doubts if you're having doubts about Scientology. So, and it just each person, I feel, gets to the point where they just can't take it anymore and they're willing to lose their family. Because if you leave, and especially if you're vocal about it, you get declared what's called a suppressive person. And that means you get excommunicated. Like I left Scientology and then they excommunicated me. And I've always told them, look, I broke up with you. Okay. It's not me. It's all you.
Yes. I like that.
Yeah, but they want to turn around and then, do this declaring you a suppressive person. And the reason why they do that is so that members of Scientology who remain don't speak to you. They're not allowed because, common sense is contagious. Like once your eyes start opening. But I will tell you this, as somebody who left Scientology with a million reasons to leave, I didn't know the half of it till I left because you're not allowed to read or listen or watch anything that's negative about Scientology. So I didn't know, even when I left Scientology, I thought, well, L. Ron Hubbard obviously went kind of crazy, but he must have started off, with well-intentioned. And now today I'm like, oh my gosh, no, it was always a scam from the beginning.
Yeah. It's fascinating too. Like connecting all of these kind of dots is, I look at cults and even, some of these behaviors, these persuasive tactics, if you will, or these social psychological processes that are operating. Scientology's done, they did their homework. They fundamentally understood how to keep people in a vulnerable position. And so I think that a lot of times, when I've looked in the research and like thinking about this, it's like, oh, like we just assume someone just like decides to join a cult and then they're like, oh, well, didn't you know? Like, why didn't you know? There's been some interesting research looking at, I was reading a study out of France, and what they had found is that one of what they called like a vulnerability factor to joining a cult is a social influence, whether that's like a friend or like a spouse gets involved or like a neighbor, something. And so just having that mere presence, knowing someone as part of that cult, like kind of sucks you in, and then they do all the other things, right? They don't allow you to have access to outside knowledge, right? They keep you in financial abuse. That's an interesting point. So like, if we were to look at Scientology as, let's just look at them as a person for a second, and saying we're in a relationship with Scientology, the financial abuse we see in abusive relationships, right? With people, there are, most of the research has been done predominantly with heterosexual couples. But in a lot of these domestic violence situations, there's been some great work by John Gottman. He's the guy, he's done a lot of like marriage, family kind of work, but he wrote a book. It was Gottman, or it was Jacobson, one of those researchers. And what they did is they had batterers, men who battered women. They had them come into the lab and like ask them questions, measured their skin response. So hook them up to electrodes and see if they're sweating or aggressive or whatnot. And one of the tactics that these guys would use is they would hold people's money. And then so when I'm talking to my students about these social psychological phenomena, there's this idea called the fundamental attribution error. And that is where we tend to blame a person for their situations or behaviors, but for ourselves, we think about the social factors. One of the examples I use, going back to the financial stuff, is why don't women leave guys who beat the shit out of them? If I could swear on here, sorry, I tend to swear.
Well, yeah. I mean, we try to keep it to a minimum, just because we'll have kids in the car.
Fair. I will try and refrain from that. So again, what happens is a lot of times we blame the victim, right? So we're committing the fundamental attribution error. Why aren't these women leaving these guys who are controlling their money, who are beating them and doing these kind of things? Well, if we stop and we think about all of the social and the other influences, it's not just that the woman is like, yeah, I want to stay. These men tend to threaten to kill the woman. They tend to threaten to kill the children. They withhold money. They stalk them. They have socially isolated them. Again, these are kind of characteristics of Scientology, right? Yeah, so it's interesting if we look at Scientology as like a person in this sense, and these abusive tactics, they've perfected what these batterers have done in a sense.
You're completely right about that. And many people in Scientology, when they've been in for a long time, there's so much money that's invested that I also can see how it's like, well, gosh, at this point, maybe because what they do in Scientology is they tell you, oh, you're still having issues. Well, you just need to do your next step. You need to do your next thing. That's all you need to do. Or there's something wrong with you. And so you need some type of interrogations, or they call it security checks. It's basically they're looking for sins or things that you did in Scientology. They're called overts and withholds. And there's the threats that you're going to lose your family. If you don't maintain your good standing with Scientology, you cannot socialize with other Scientologists. So you're right. It very much is that way. And there is a long documented history of physical violence and abuse, starting at the very top of Scientology with the current leader, David Miscavige, who has been running Scientology longer than L. Ron Hubbard did. David Miscavige has been in charge.
How long?
Well, David Miscavige L. Ron Hubbard died in 86, so he took over about then. And he wasn't even the person who was supposed to take over. It was a coup.
Oh, wow.
Mm-hmm. He just started getting rid of people who were trying, not on board with him taking over. Before L. Ron Hubbard died, he put a couple called Pat and Annie Broker were going to be in charge of Scientology. And right after he died, there were all these letters that went out. People had them on their desks about they had this loyal officer status, Pat and Annie Broker. Next thing you know, those are gone. David Miscavige is asserting himself as the leader. He's locking senior executives in Scientology in a double wide trailer, put bars on the window, put a guard at the door, uses food as punishment, rice and beans if you're not making your quotas, sleep deprivation. People in the C organization aren't getting medical care. They aren't getting any type of health screenings. So there's a problem with, as they get older, what's going to happen.
Well, and so what you're getting at too is like now with David Miscavige, and the one thing that concerns me, and I was reading about Leah, is it Remy?
Leah Remini.
Remy, right? Like it appears from what I read that one of her breaking points was, where's his wife? Right?
Yeah.
Like no one had seen her since I believe it was her father's funeral or something. Like she hasn't been seen since. Yeah. And so it's like these are going. Like we're talking about psychological and physical. We are talking about torture. Like these are aspects of torture. And interestingly, we could go down kind of. I don't want to give the Scientologists too much ammo, but the American Psychological Association was in bed with the CIA in training the interrogators at Guantanamo Bay. The American Psychiatric Association started first. Their members got wind of it, and then they pulled out. And then the APA was like, okay, we'll do it. The two psychologists, I forget their name, they've never been prosecuted. But so again, my profession isn't clean of anything, but what I'm trying to do is paint this picture of like, these are known torture and abusive tactics that people are using to get whatever it is that they want. And it is evil.
Yeah, very much so. The manipulation that occurs, again, for many Scientologists is unknown to them until you've left and you start learning about how that actually happened. And unfortunately, in Scientology, members are led to believe that the psychiatrists are evil. That I remember growing up in school as a child being afraid to go to the counselor's office because those evil, dirty psychs are going to just put me on drugs. And it's completely not accurate. So what ends up happening often is members will leave, but still not necessarily seek out valid mental health treatment and help because they've been so poisoned against it. So I'm on a foundation called the SPTV Foundation that helps former members get back on their feet. If they're in trouble, a lot of times it's basically on an emergency basis often. And sometimes it can take years for a former Scientologist to decide, I think this would be okay that I see a counselor or a therapist or a psychiatrist. But then when they do, it is absolutely life-changing and life-saving for some of them. And in my mind, it compounds the damage that Scientology does, because not only are you emotionally, mentally, and often physically damaging someone, but you're taking away the one thing that could help them when they leave.
Yeah, I mean, exactly. It's like, Scientology is poisoning the well. They're like they're harming you. And then, like you said, it's like there are solutions to help people, social supports, all this kind of stuff. And then it's just like, no, if you do that thing, you're bad, you know, or whatever it is.
Yeah.
And again, you know, people's critiques of any profession, if they're critiquing it from an evidence-based point, is fine with me. Like I said, I'm the first one to know. I just brought up how the APA was in bed with the military training people to torture people in Guantanamo Bay. After that was found out, by the way, it is in our ethics code. If you Google the current version of the ethics code, it says psychologists will not participate in torture, right? It got that much attention, was that big of a deal. But back to this idea of like adequate mental health treatment stuff. For example, you know, someone who specializes in ADHD and diagnosing ADHD. ADHD is one of the most severe psychiatric disorders that we have. You can Google online, you can find Dr. Russell Barkley, who is literally the guy who wrote the textbook on ADHD. It's in my office, sitting right here next to me. It's in its 4th edition, and he wrote what's called a white paper. So it wasn't necessarily peer reviewed, but he takes peer reviewed data and he presented it to the government. And he goes through there and he lists the societal costs and the social costs and the personal costs that people with ADHD suffer from. People with ADHD are more likely to experience accidents of any kind. People with ADHD are more likely to be divorced. People with ADHD are more likely to drop out of school. People with ADHD are at an increased risk of dying early, right? So when Scientology in the 1990s was like, Ritalin is evil, what they did is they implanted an idea of stopping people from getting, for ADHD, medication is the first line treatment. We know that. You can read the American Academy of Pediatrics. I believe their latest guidelines were maybe 2017 for ADHD. And for children above the age of 8, medications is the first line treatment. What I'm saying though is, you know, we can all have our opinions about medications, and there are side effects to medications. And if people want to talk about that's fine. But what Scientology did is they said, no, Prozac was another one that's used to treat anxiety and depression. So they're inherently taking away these ability for people to get some sort of relief. And my problem is, if you're listening to someone who is not a mental health professional, and again, I'm not a psychiatrist, I can tell you what the scientific evidence says. And I always say, go talk to your primary care doctor about this. You're robbing people of a chance to get that help. In these difficulties, people should have that ability to get some treatment. And these are really costly difficulties that aren't anybody's fault.
Yeah. And they're not even acknowledged. ADHD, mental illness, it's not something that's addressed or acknowledged that there's such thing in Scientology. And Scientology takes it a step further. If you take psychiatric medications, you become what's called an illegal pre-clear. A pre-clear in Scientology is someone who receives Scientology auditing, which are their processes that they do. So if you're on psychiatric medication, you cannot progress up Scientology. They have like this bridge, they call it, and there's step after step after step after step on it that you pay for each step and progress. So they actually outlaw it because I think I heard though that as long as it wasn't prescribed by a psychologist or a psychiatrist, like if it was from your primary medical doctor, if you stop taking it, they might let you do some more Scientology. But so it, again, they just doubled down on, and that's where a lot of, I mean, there's been so many cases of people or Scientologists taking their loved ones or taking themselves off of medication with devastating consequences, people losing their lives over it.
Well, yeah, I think we were talking about this before we started. You know, I was reading about, I forget what the woman's name was, but I think this was in the 70s or 80s. And the woman was a Scientologist, and she was, you know, auditing her son, who apparently was displaying symptoms of psychosis. Psychosis is an umbrella term, and right, the general definition is losing touch with reality. Psychosis can manifest in hallucinations, and there's various hallucinations: auditory, hearing stuff that isn't there; visual, seeing stuff that isn't there. There's actually tactile, right? Like feeling bugs crawling on your skin that aren't there. There's olfactory hallucinations, smelling stuff that isn't there, and then tasting things that aren't there. So that's part of psychosis. There's actually, and then there's delusions. Like if I was to believe I was actually Superman, right? Like that's not true. It's a fixed belief, right? But what I'm saying is apparently this young man was showing some of these symptoms, and psychiatric psychosis is very difficult to treat, but there are things that we can do to help people. Medication is not an end all be all. Like it's not a magic bullet. It helps. But this woman apparently took her son off medication, and then he stabbed her 77 times. And like, so when people tell me that ideas aren't dangerous, right? They clearly are if people are acting on them, right? Exactly. And so this woman lost her life to her son who had an illness that is not his fault, and he stabbed her because he was having some of these psychotic symptoms, it appears.
Yes, Jeremy Perkins and Ellie Perkins. Ellie Perkins, I think, was the mom, and Jeremy Perkins. Here, actually, even Sandy's saying, yeah, it was Jeremy Perkins who eventually killed his mother, Ellie.
And that just breaks my heart. Like, you know, there was no reason for. First of all, you know, this again is where, like, it's really interesting to me of what's happened. Some people have argued have happened over the decades is our erosion in trust in experts. And this woman, you know, Ellie believed that she knew more than a medical professional, and that decision cost her her life, right? Or was at least one factor in that, right? So when we think about experts can be wrong, right? Again, we're human. Like experts can be wrong. I'm not denying that. But I think about when I make decisions, I think about it like you're placing a bet. Okay, if you're going to bet between taking medical advice from your doctor or from a Scientologist, and you're going to bet, who are you going to put your money on, right? Or who should you, based on the evidence, put your money on? So that's kind of how I think about a lot of things. And what I try to teach my students is ask yourself, what is the evidence? Who is the expert in this situation? Again, they can be wrong, and people need to advocate for themselves, advocate for their children. But again, it clearly in this situation, it cost someone their life. And now Jeremy, you know, I don't know whatever happened to him, but he has to live with the fact that he killed his mom. So these ideas can lead to crimes that are not victimless. And going back to crimes, L. Ron Hubbard explicitly stated that the psychiatric community was responsible for crime. He blames the Holocaust. He blames even like Xenu getting the body Thetans. I mean, trapping all the alien souls because of overpopulation. That was all. You know, the evil psychiatrists are behind everything. Yes. I had a quote in my notes. So apparently this quote that I have from this was from Hubbard 1982 in an IAS bulletin. He asserted that psychiatrists and psychologists cause crime. So, and then he says, so what is the cause of crime? The treatment, of course, electric shocks, behavior modification, abuse of the soul. These are the causes of crime. There would be no criminals at all if the psychiatrists had not begun to oppress beings into vengeance against society. Unfortunately, what L. Ron Hubbard, I mean, that's just clearly wrong. So first of all, again, like I said in the city council meeting, there's no one cause of depression. There is also no one cause of crime. There is a theory of crime that looks at what's called 8 criminogenic risk factors. 8 factors that influence the probability that someone may commit a crime. right? If some of these factors are present. So, one of the factors is antisocial attitudes, believing it's okay to harm people, right? The biggest predictor, of criminal behavior, past criminal behavior, right? So, it's funny how that works. But what we're saying is that L. Ron Hubbard, he makes these grandiose claims. Another thing, another sign of pseudoscience kind of coming back, it's some people call it the Sagan standard after Carl Sagan, who borrowed from other philosophers, Hume among them, but basically this idea, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. L. Ron Hubbard says there is one cause for mental illness. So that's why I went there. I said, that's just empirically false, right? Yeah. We know that mental health concerns are multifactorial. Same thing what he's saying here of crime. There is one cause of crime, and somehow psychiatrists and psychologists are to blame. That is also empirically false, right? So when you want to kind of keep your baloney detector up and you hear people making these really outlandish claims, that's a sign of pseudoscience. And Hubbard did it all the time.
He did. It was so much of it is it's the confidence. It's all part of the con, is what I've come to realize, is he just spoke with such authority that people just believed it. I want to grab a couple of these questions before I get too behind. And I thought it'd be fun. Everybody in the chat or who's watching, if you feel comfortable, pop in what state or city where you're watching from. I think that'd be a lot of fun for Jordan and his students at all. So pop in the chat. If you're on the replay, jump in the comments and let us know, where are you joining us from? Hunter Bay says, thank you for coming on from Ludington, Michigan.
Awesome.
Let's see. Mary James says, Jordan, were you aware of Natalie and other channels or protesters before now?
Not really. The way that I think, I care about science and pseudoscience and stuff, like in a general kind of framework. And it just so happened that, Scientology decided to step into Portage. And so this is kind of like where I went. So really, any pseudoscientific claim kind of triggers me, again, even if it's in the mental health profession. So I wasn't. Then Natalie, I got your email. And I started watching your videos, and then I started doing some more research. I've gone into the scientific databases, and, I've been doing some more reading and have become even more interested in Scientology because I looked in one of the databases. It's called PsycInfo. There were only a handful of articles, and they weren't really about like Scientology specifically. They were kind of like commentaries and stuff. They weren't studies about people who had been in Scientology or who hadn't. So this is an area, if there are researchers out there and stuff, and maybe what I could do on my end, but this is an area where there's a lot of work to be done that I'm thinking of, how researchers, how clinicians, how we can help better understand the problem and help people who want to get out or are trying to get out, because they're clearly, one of the studies I found, when people leave cults in general, there tends to be an increase in mental health concerns. That's just something and it kind of seems like no duh, but that's why we have science to check our common sense intuitions. But that was my long-winded way of how I came about here.
All right, let me grab another. Scooter says, Jordan, you were absolutely fantastic.
Thank you. That's very kind.
Let's see. Monica, are you going to talk about the significant city council meeting in Clearwater yesterday? They just handed Scientology everything they wanted with no request for good faith actions. Monica, I am. I'm going to be talking about that tomorrow. In fact, I'm going to have Mark Bunker on, who was on city council and also been a long time critic of Scientology. We're going to talk about that tomorrow, so stay tuned. Spicy Cat Foster says, students of this man, you are lucky.
Again, very kind, very kind.
Cats Hates Cult. Is Jordan familiar with the Lisa McPherson and Whitney Mills case? And I can fill you in on that if you're not familiar.
Was McPherson? No, that was Debbie Cook.
Lisa McPherson was a public Scientologist. In Scientology, they refer to their members as public because you're a public or your staff or your C organization. Lisa McPherson was a public Scientologist and she was having some mental health issues. She drove her car down the street, stopped, got out, and was, took her clothes off and said she needed help, was taken to a hospital for mental health evaluation, but Scientologists showed up and intervened and convinced her to go with them. So if you have a mental, exactly, she died 14 days later. Or something like that. I don't know if that's the exact amount of days, but they did what L. Ron Hubbard said to do. If somebody is experiencing psychosis in Scientology, that's called a potential trouble source. There are 3 different types. And the third one, potential trouble source type 3, means psychosis or a big break with reality. But rather than getting them legitimate help or getting her that help, she was taken to a room at the Fort Harrison, kept under a watch. People who came in were not allowed to speak to her. And she deteriorated. I mean, there's a whole thing that goes along with this. But she ended up losing her life. She didn't get the proper care. I do believe she passed away on the way to the hospital. Whitney Mills is a Scientologist that just a couple years ago, she was a resident of Clearwater, Florida. She had done all Scientology that you could do she was what's called an operating Thetan level 8. She was sharing that she was having hallucinations. She had people who were watching her, but because of Lisa McPherson, what they did with Whitney Mills is they didn't take her to the Fort Harrison Hotel and keep her there like they did McPherson. She had people, Scientologists, who were in charge of her. Her doctor was Dr. David Minkoff, who was the doctor involved with Lisa McPherson, who then had a hefty amount of money to pay after a civil lawsuit. So this guy, again, is the doctor for a Scientologist, Whitney Mills. There's text messages that show that she's like, it's just all too much. She got no mental health treatment. He told her that she just needed to be an operating Thetan. He basically, in Scientology words, said, buck up and you will get through this. Like, you're bigger than this. A doctor, a medical doctor. She ended up trying to set herself on fire. And when that didn't work, she took a pew. On YouTube, there's certain words we stay away from because it'll limit how many people the video reaches. And she unalived herself, which is the word we use on YouTube instead of, the what it actually is. Tragic. And this was just a couple of years ago. And another situation where a Scientologist doesn't get the mental health treatment that they need, and they were prevented from getting it from their own doctor because that doctor was a Scientologist.
That's just awful. And like heartbreak. Like, that's the thing, is like just heartbreaking for someone, who is clearly suffering. And here, to me, this is the paradox. This is the paradox of Scientology. You are suffering, but and we are causing your suffering, but we claim that we are going to cure you over your suffering.
Yeah.
It's like, no, like, we know that there are scientific based ways to help people manage these kind of things, especially when it comes to psychosis and these kind of things. And so that, to me, that paradox of cults and of Scientology and stuff, and it's like, how it's called cognitive dissonance, right? Like, how do you square those two? And they'll be like, oh, we're doing it for whatever, for Xenu or whatever.
Yeah, exactly. It makes no sense. Tori Preston is asking, does this guy have his own channel? I've done a diploma for behavioral science, and I'm going for my master's in psychology. He is right up my alley. I'd love to see more of him.
I do not. Sorry. Hopefully I can be on here more, Yeah,
exactly. We'll have him on more. Do you think L. Ron Hubbard should be fact-checked to help in situations like the one in Michigan? If so, would you be willing to help those fighting this quackery? And I guess from it's your point of view with your background is so valuable because you can actually say, here is, this is what should have happened. But what do you think? What was the actual question there? Oh, do you think L. Ron Hubbard should be fact checked to help the situation like the one in Michigan?
Yeah, I think one of the things is I tried to be. I had 3 minutes if we're talking about like when I was at the talking in front of city council, and the gentleman who spoke after me, his name is Dick. Him and his wife Pat are amazing people. They're like my adoptive grandparents. Love them dearly. So I think they might be watching right now. Shout out to them. But Dick was like, "Hey, you can say whatever you want in the council meeting, but you only have 3 minutes." And clearly, I am verbose. So I spent the entire day constructing my argument and how I could hit it in 3 minutes. And so what I'm saying is one of the things that was on my mind is I need to point out some of these ideas of pseudoscience, why it's unhelpful. Like this idea of opportunity cost. I don't know if that came across clearly when I was speaking in front. Opportunity cost is the loss of opportunity because you took a different action. So you read Scientology, you go into Scientology at the expense of getting adequate mental health treatment. That's what I was trying to convey to them. So, doing that. And then, yes, like presenting the facts, fact checking. Okay, L. Ron Hubbard said this, and that's why I used his quotes as well, right? I was like, no, like this is what this guy says. Are you going to believe this? So as far as like fact checking, doing those kind of things, and even if you have to be like, okay, that's why I said also go to the Division 12 website of APA, the Division of Clinical Psychology, and you will not find Dianetics listed as a scientifically supported treatment.
Yeah, so that is very clear. That is so very true. Marcy, aloha. We get to use the aloha button. Marcy, thank you so much for gifting 5 Life After a Cult memberships. Whoever got those, shout out to Marcy. Give her a big aloha there. Let's see. Ethan has a question. In class, this must be one of your students. Jordan said he thought there would be a smear campaign about him. Do you think this is true? Well, anything is possible when it comes to Scientology. They tend to want to discredit people who are exposing them or what they consider to be critical about them. The good news is there are so many people doing that Scientology cannot keep up. And even for myself here, on almost a daily basis, 6 days a week, I'm here talking about the reasons why Scientology is a family destroying human trafficking cult. And, sure, they send some trolls and stuff, but there's really not much that they can do because, number one, especially many of us here on YouTube, a lot of us are former members. They know we're not lying. It's our own experiences. They know it. Some of the people who have left Scientology and turned whistleblower are the people who were hiding some of these things. So much of that has come out. So I wouldn't worry about it too much, but I would just, it's always good to have your head on a swivel. And if any new people start showing up in your life, question it.
Yeah. No, we had a good laugh at it, and I was, not, I wasn't like trying to scare. I'm a realist. Like I said, I've read, followed, their tactics and stuff. So I was like, it wouldn't surprise me if, someone tried to say all these kind of things, but really, I don't think I'm that interesting or whatever. So it's like you guys are wasting your time. Like there's bigger fish to fry. Like, I'm just this guy.
Super Weekend Warriors says psychologists and psychiatrists work closely with law enforcement agencies to do things also like criminal and psych profiling. That makes sense. Tori Preston says, this is my live stream. I have ADHD. I'm fascinated with Scientology and going to school to work in the field of psychology. That's awesome, Tori. Make sure that you subscribe there.
That's awesome.
Let's see. Oh, Sarah says, Jordan students, you have a great teacher.
You guys are too kind. I appreciate all these kind comments, and
The bipolar astrophotographer says, statistically speaking, how many Scientologists have undiagnosed and untreated mental illness? Well, that's an interesting question. It's not something that has been tracked or studied. I do know, I mean, the number of people who come out of Scientology, I can't say that I've met anyone who has left Scientology that didn't have, not necessarily diagnosed, but wasn't struggling in some way with mental health issues. I honestly, I can't think of one that I've met or had an opportunity to speak to. It's a lot of what drives us to leave is we just can't take it anymore, but we don't understand because we've never been allowed to have access to mental health treatment. We don't understand the mechanics of what's actually going on, which kind of reminds me of a question I wanted to ask you, because you talked about how people who, are like, and I've shared with you currently in Scientology, many of them are victims of the mind control of Scientology. And, when you were talking about somebody in an abusive relationship, like you can drive them right back into it. What do you think, in your opinion, do you have any suggestions of ways that, whether it's former members or people who are live streaming or protesting Scientology, what do you think might be effective in conversations with Scientologists or people who might be having doubts?
For me, one of the things I try to clearly I'm been described as passionate. I think one of the big things when it comes to these conversations, because they can be so heated, we really have to temper our passions in the sense of, or like over angry. Like obviously you want to be passionate.
Yeah.
One of the hardest things in actually works as like a backfire is when you tell someone that they're stupid or that they're believe in pseudoscience and you just hit them. None of us like hearing that, and we're more likely to shut down and or, again, it's called reactance. We dig into our beliefs and we dig in our heels even more. One of the things that can be really helpful, actually, is you can check out on YouTube. I forget what the gentleman's name is, but it's called Street Epistemology. And it's this gentleman who just goes around and he uses what's called Socratic questioning, named after Socrates. And basically, you enter an equal discussion. You are not trying to one-up a Scientologist. Like, I'm not trying to make them look stupid or anything. You're really just, you are trying to engage them in a dialogue. Be like, what is your evidence for that? Or I hear you say, like, so Xenu, so you believe that there was this entity named Xenu, right? So how does that work? What evidence do you have that Xenu actually exists, right? So you can ask these questions in a non-confrontational manner. And the research is pretty clear on this. Like, you're going to get more out of that than just hammering people. And the other thing, Natalie, I think you and I talked about it. I feel bad. I feel sorry for people who believe some of these things, right? It's like, they're not necessarily evil people. I don't believe that people wake up in the morning and they're, like cackling, like in a supervillain laugh and like out to go do evil, right? Especially if they've been raised and indoctrinated in this belief system. So I also think when we interact with Scientologists specifically, to a degree, having some compassion and being like, wow, like in a way we could think about it as like a mind virus, right? That has been infected them. And when people are sick, what do? We take care of them and we show them compassion. Again, I'm not trying to pathologize Scientologists and stuff. I have my own personal beliefs and these kind of things, but I really think trying to have a discussion, and if you can, about what they believe, why they believe, in trying to use some evidence, but yelling at people isn't very effective. And also, too, values, right? It's like the thing that I think about, human beings, we are meaning-making creatures.
Yes.
People who go into Scientology, I believe, and we've seen this with the scientific research for people who enter cults in general, one of the major factors is people are seeking a source of meaning. How can I fault someone for that? This person believes that this thing gives their life meaning. They're clearly doing things that I don't agree with. But to me, that also kind of fosters some compassion. I hope that this tangent was helpful.
Yeah, no, very much so, because it's often a question that comes up because there are different people who show up to live stream or protest Scientology have different approaches. So often a question comes up of, is there a more effective way of actually getting through? People who tend to protest Scientology do it for different reasons. And for me personally, I do what I do to educate so people don't fall prey, not just to Scientology, but other cults as well, because they all seem to use the same playbook. And the other thing is to be a landing spot, you know, for people who are in Scientology and having doubts. People, we refer to them as under the radar. They can't quite leave because of the family connection. And it does seem to be the common denominator. I even asked a Scientologist who used to be on the other side of the protests, where she would try to handle protesters to get them to stop. Her name's Tori Magoo 44 here on YouTube, Tori Chrisman. And she has been exposing Scientology for decades now. But she said one thing that impacted her, that a protester said to her when she was still a very dedicated Scientologist, is he very kindly said, if you're so free, if you're really free, why can't you read anything you want? And he asked her that a couple of times, and she said that stuck with her. So it's really interesting to me what you're saying from from the viewpoint of psychology and mental health. I would agree that any way we can approach them more with that kindness and try to, you know, reason if there's an opportunity for a conversation, or even with signs, there's things that I've thought, like, I like to say your doubts are valid when I've gone and protested Scientology, because I know for a fact every Scientologist has doubts about it. They just will not say it because it will then cost them money in Scientology.
Yeah. And I think the other thing too that we're kind of getting back here, and like, you're right, like that question was very poignant that he asked him, like, if you're so free, asking people these questions, things that they maybe never contemplated. But the thing that we know, again, we're talking about value systems, right? So, like, you know, I loosely use the term, they hide under it, you know, like a religion for Scientology. I mean, it's more of a cult, but people are joining it for certain value systems, and people who are opposed to it have certain value systems. It's the same thing with political discussions, really, when you think about it kind of from this fundamental level. And what doesn't work? Just yelling at people does not work. It's not effective. So one of the things that we can do, you know, is at least extend that olive branch, you know, to people and being like, hey, you know, if you can, obviously this is kind of pie in the sky, but like, hey, you know, just talk to them, ask them for coffee if it's a family member or whatever. And again, you just want to be careful. Like, you're not trying to necessarily change their mind. You know, again, I honestly didn't think that much would come of my going to the city council. For me, I operate on what's under my control. And when Dick told me, he's like, this will be public record, I said, okay, it'll be recorded. It'll be public record. There's at least an opposition to this proclamation. That was under my control, right? I can't control what other people believe, but I can do things to try to influence them in a positive direction. Have a well-formed argument. Be kind. Be opening to listening to them, right? And I think that is clearly, again, what the research shows is probably more effective than yelling at people.
Yes, and I would agree with that. It can be cathartic at times for, I think, especially former members. You know, when I went to Clearwater to protest, and one of the things that I would say, I said, you know, David Miscavige is a squirrel. A squirrel in Scientology is someone who alters Scientology from what L. Ron Hubbard said to do. And most Scientologists, because you're indoctrinated, the number one policy in Scientology is called Keeping Scientology Working, and it's on every major course. So Scientologists have to read this, and it's pages long. over and over and over again. And it kind of lays out the rules, and basically that you do not alter Scientology. So I try to point out, like, hey, like L. Ron Hubbard specifically said, don't do fundraising, yet it's fundraising all the time in Scientology. And I agree with you. I think that those things are very impactful. It's funny you mentioned Socratic questioning earlier, because Carla's loving wife says, Jordan, now is a great time to review Socratic questioning. We just talked about that.
Yeah. And to kind of flush it out a little bit more, there's a fantastic book. Actually, in part of my notes for this discussion, I read this book recently and I took notes on it, and then so I have them here. But there's a fantastic book called, I believe it's called Socratic Questioning. Let me, sorry, real quick. Where did that go? I don't know where it went. Socratic.
Yeah, you look it up. I'm just going to
I want to give you guys. Okay.
While you look that up, Professor Kakan says Hubbard had multiple arrests and convictions around the world. Very true, Professor Kakan. Molly Lang, good to see you. How the Purification Rundown not a violation of state medical practice acts, or how is it not a violation? So the Purification Rundown, I don't know if you're familiar with that, Jordan, but it's the sauna program where L. Ron Hubbard wrote a book called Clear Body, Clear Mind, where he said that all these drugs and toxins are in the fatty tissues. And if you do his sauna program for 5 hours a day, take copious amounts of niacin and other vitamins, that you will sweat out the toxins and they'll go away. And I guess Molly's question is, how is that not a violation of the State Medical Practices Act?
Honestly, I have no idea. And even with auditing, right? Like auditing, from my understanding of auditing, I mean, they're using somewhat psychotherapeutic techniques, right? So for example, for people, one of the techniques we use to help people with PTSD, we do have them relive a trauma, and we ask them like pointed questions and stuff about that to kind of, there's what's called cognitive processing therapy and these kind of things. So I've been wondering that is like, how can Scientologists get away with like kind of doing these mental health practices that we have to do in a very specific way? Mm-hmm. How are they able to just do that? I have no idea. And
I'm guessing they hide a lot behind religion. It's a religious practice.
Yeah. And real quick, I wanted to mention, so the book, for all of you out there, you should purchase the book called The Socratic Way of Questioning: How to Use Socrates' Method to Discover the Truth and Argue Wisely. Socratic questioning is this idea of consistently asking questions to try and determine what you're actually talking about. Mm-hmm. So it's like when people say, if someone was to say, again, like Xenu, okay, so what did Xenu look like? And you get the person, what is your evidence that Xenu exists? What kind of evidence would you need to suggest that Xenu existed?
It would be a good one, I wonder, because so most Scientologists don't even know about Xenu, because you have to get up to what's called operating Thetan level 3.
Oh, that's right.
It's so expensive that most don't get there. But the reactive mind, just even talking about that, because L. Ron Hubbard said we have a reactive mind which records moments of pain and unconsciousness, and then we are exposed to smells or sights that were in that memory or that recording, that it triggers us.
Well, and the thing, when I'm reading about this reactive mind, so first of all, in Hubbard does acknowledge in some places he clearly stole from Freud, like what is called the tripartite, the 3-part model of the mind. And even if you really read Freud, he was kind of loosey-goosey on if he thought all three and like the weight that he gave to the id, ego, superego. Those are also mistranslations, by the way. That's a whole nother thing. But this idea of the reactive mind as the sole, cause. So Socratic questioning, it's like, how do you know the reactive mind exists, right? And how does this reactive mind, how is it separated exactly from the somatic mind and the analytical mind? What is the mechanism by which it is separated, brought back together? Other things of like, Hubbard claimed, there was something about, he claimed that, was it the engrams could be passed on like in utero? Okay, like what does an engram look like? How come we've never seen one under a microscope? Right. And it's just about asking these questions. But if you take that ability away from people, then they kind of just go along.
In Scientology, when you start asking questions like that, like if you're not accepting what L. Ron Hubbard say, let's just use this example of the reactive mind, and you're going, well, I mean, I don't know, it just doesn't seem real to me. Then they have procedures they will do on you so that you do get it. Because first thing they check, they assume if you're not understanding it or you're not accepting it, you have misunderstood words. Right? Which reading anything, if you don't understand a lot of the words, that's possible.
Yeah.
But then failing that, and you're still not accepting the information that there is a reactive mind and that we are thetans, and that in believing that you've lived before multiple times, if you're not accepting it the way L. Ron Hubbard's laying it out, they do a procedure called false data stripping. And false data stripping, number one, it's under the assumption that your data is false because it doesn't align with what L. Ron Hubbard said. So we're going to do you a favor and run you through these steps to strip away your false information so you can now accept L. Ron Hubbard and what he's saying is the truth. This man told us what we should feed our babies, not breastfeed, that we should do this barley formula with a bunch of Karo syrup. I mean, I did it when my kids were babies. It just mortifies me today. Everything he said in the Sea Organization, he had policies on how to wash a car, how to clean windows, how to do laundry. You couldn't use scented products. It was all how he said it was. So in Scientology, there are multiple different ways that they work to reprogram you or program you to keep those blinders on.
Yeah. Yeah. That's just crazy too, of just thinking about the degree of which Hubbard wanted to control behavior. And that's another clear sign of cults, right? Of like, they fundamentally try to change routines. It's like, wait a minute, why do you care how I feed my child? Or why do you care how I wash my car? Right. But they're eroding, they're increasing reliance on the leader, on the message. You will be lost without me. Yeah, that's amazing.
It's completely how it is. Let's see. Anna from Canada. Thank you for being a member for 8 months. She says, we heard you in Vancouver. Nice. I don't know. A lot of people were chiming in where they're watching from, and it's all over the world. Animal Audit Corner has a question. Now, are there laws now that would prevent groups like Scientology going in and taking people out of hospitals, like in the Lisa McPherson case? Not that I'm aware of. Are you aware of any?
No, I mean, not off the top of my head. That is a really great question, though, of like,
they do it under the guise of they're her spiritual leaders, her clergy, that they're coming in. It's so insidious how Scientology uses this cloak of religion to actually harm people.
Well, and kind of, I think you had mentioned earlier too, like this idea, and I think some of what I've read, right? Like, you go to a medical doctor who is a Scientologist. You go to a dentist who is a Scientologist. Yeah. So you get I'm wondering if part of the way that they may operate would be, will you have some sort of quasi or medical professional go in there and say, yep, now they're under our care, and it's like, oh, okay, that person has an MD after their name. Like, yep, okay, good to go. But that would be really interesting, because you can't just walk in and take someone out. And again, so like obviously some of the stuff in the 70s is different, but it's like, you know, again, because there are laws in liabilities. If you have admitted someone because they are a risk to harm themselves or others, and they are under your care, and you just kind of let them go to someone else without any real kind of concrete way, like, to me in 2025, a hospital would be opening themselves up to a ton of liability. So I think that would be really, really difficult to pull off. I hope it would be. I hope it would be.
You'd hope it would be.
Yeah.
When we were talking about the reactive mind, it's interesting. So Professor Kakan says, you believe you have a reactive mind until you realize it was a self-created delusion. So in Scientology, early on, L. Ron Hubbard says, oh, you have a reactive mind. You have a reactive mind. You have a reactive mind. As you move up the steps in Scientology and you achieve their state of what's called clear, which is a person who no longer has their own reactive mind, the big realization you have, which is confidential, they don't tell you this, but every single person who achieves the state of clear basically has to voice something like this. It's basically, I realize that I've been creating my own reactive mind and I'm not going to do it anymore. So you're literally, when I found that out, I was so pissed because I did that step where they call it like validating your state of clear, but I don't know what I said that got me to pass go.
Yeah.
No one knows what their big realization is. And then I found out after I left Scientology, and I can remember in that particular Scientology session talking about that. And I did have a realization that, like, wait a minute, if this is something that I have control over, then why? I don't need to do that. And that was close enough. It's like, oh, now you're clear. But after leaving, I'm like, oh, this really pisses me off because I'm like, you told us we had a reactive mind. And then after $100,000 or whatever it is, it's like, oh, you were making it up the whole time. Like you just had to like click your heels together and you could have gone home, kind of BS.
Yeah. It's a game and it's a trap, right? It's like you're playing a game with loaded die, right? And they're a dealer with a loaded deck. Right, you know, if you're gambling or whatever, they've literally stacked the deck against you, and then they're just like, oh, just kidding, right? And it's like, what? Like that seems kind of mean.
Paralyzed to paralyzed brings up a great point. There was a survey that was done of former Scientologists recently, and the survey we did of ex-Scientologists indicated a 23 times higher rate of psychosis than the U.S. national average.
I believe I had seen something about, and again, I can't remember off the top of my head. I think the study I was reading was about like cults in general, but it may have been Scientology of like increased risk. So like depersonalization or derealization, which can be, they're kind of these psychotic states, if you will. So like depersonalization is this experience where you feel like you're outside of your body, which is a really phenomenon to.
In Scientology, that's exteriorization. That's like you're an operating thetan. You can exist outside of your body and have full perceptions. That's literally the goal. So what is depersonalization?
So depersonalization is like it's people with panic disorder can experience this, where you just feel like you're outside of your body. And some people might claim to be like, yeah, I was looking down on my body. When they get in these really it happens a lot for some people with PTSD as well, where when they get so panicked and so reactive, they feel like they're outside of their body. Then
that's interesting. I talked about that when I went through my essay experience, which is a weird thing to call it experience. I don't know where that came from. Anyways, when I was sharing about it, when I would think about it's like I was watching it from across the room when it was happening. Like that's how it felt. And it was incredibly traumatic, but it was It was like like I was watching it from across the room.
Interesting. What is the essay? Is that
Sexual assault. It's so on YouTube.
oh SA like the letter? Yes, yes, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. So,
yeah,
so yes, that reaction is very common from that would be a symptom of depersonalization that
yeah.
abuse victims frequently report. Yeah, so that would be
Interesting.
an example of that. And then there's derealization. This is another really odd phenomenological perspective where you feel like there's this feeling that life isn't real, like things around you aren't real. It's almost like this feeling of almost kind of like a dream state. Some people describe it as kind of hazy or like feeling like they're in a movie is what some people describe it as. And that's another phenomena that has been reported to, I think, be higher in people who have come from cults and stuff like that.
Well, that happened to me all the time in the Sea organization. I would have those feelings like it just doesn't feel like it's real. I feel like I'm just going through these motions, and I'm so like not attached to reality because you're not part of the world. You're living in this bubble.
It'd be interesting to see if I wonder if the depersonalization. So again, it's a phenomenological experience. It feels weird. It's more than just I'm going through the motions. It's like this really weird experience. It's hard to put into words. But it would be interesting to see, if because Scientology creates this going through the motions, if that kind of is a risk factor for then some of the depersonalization or these kind of like psychotic kind of symptoms. Because as humans, we're meant to go into the world, we're meant to kind of experience a range of emotions, these kind of things. And so I could just see if you're just kind of going through the life and you're experiencing abusive and traumatic experiences, it's like you're almost like your psychological threshold is lower, you have all this stress, you're more likely to kind of disconnect. And some psychologists hypothesize, some researchers are like, the reason people who have been through traumatic experiences dissociate, so dissociation, depersonalization, derealization, they all hang together. It's probably some potentially sort of self-protective mechanism, just like emotionally, like your body is just like, I've had enough. And someone put in the comments too, sleep deprivation doesn't help. No, it does not. People
let's talk about that, because sleep deprivation is a huge tool used in Scientology, especially for the staff members and the Sea organization members. It's very, very common to stay up all night. Everything is an emergency. Everything has to be done right now. All emergencies are equal to all emergencies. You're just constantly kept in this state of fight or flight. What role does sleep deprivation play for people who are in Scientology and going through this?
So this is great, and again, kind of one of the tools. So we know sleep deprivation. So I'm wondering if this is kind of like one of the things. Sleep deprivation. The more you're sleep deprived, the more likely you are to have like psychotic symptoms. Like that's just something that we know. So one of the mechanisms, again, probably operating for some people in these cults or Scientology, is being incredibly sleep deprived. We're just more likely for whatever. I'm not a sleep expert, but I just know that that's kind of one of the things that can happen. Sleep, we don't know exactly 100% like why we need it, but it's clear we do need it. And there's something, some people have argued, sleep kind of like resets the brain and kind of like clears stuff from out the day, like information that we don't need. Like that's kind of a hypothesis, if you will. And maybe there's something going on where that being disrupted is just leading to these kind of like psychotic experiences. That is really, really interesting. Also really, really scary. Because being sleep deprived, right? It's like, you're more likely to have accidents. You're telling me people are if you're on the Sea Org, you're on one of the ships or whatever, like doing whatever the heck you're doing. And it's like, why would you want someone sleep deprived, like steering the ship or doing any of those things? Like, that's dangerous.
Yeah, exactly. Using machinery, in the sea organization, doing renovations, doing construction, and it would happen and people would get hurt. But it's such a key torture tool because if you don't get what you need to get done, every single person in the sea organization or staff member has a statistic. So it's something that can be measured. If your job is to sell books, however many books you sell a day, a week, is how you are judged. So if you wash dishes, it could be like how many dishes, and you have a graph and you have to graph it every day and every week. And the week in Scientology goes from Thursday at 2 to Thursday at 2. So it's this mad frenzy to get your statistics up. And growing up in Scientology, we were indoctrinated as children to believe that our value was based on what we could do for the group. So what we could do to contribute. And of course, kids should contribute and learn how the world works. But this it was a whole nother level of, I remember growing up and thinking like the worst thing I could do is distract my mother from Scientology, from doing Scientology, getting in trouble at school, needing to go to the doctor, anything that interrupted her focus on Scientology was not okay. And so we grow up not even like, I didn't know well into adulthood. You talk about how often in that situation, children are not having their needs met. I didn't even know that I should have been having my needs met. Even when I looked back, I still was holding on to that mindset. Well, yes, my mother she had a mission. They were saving the planet, they were clearing the planet. So you sacrifice family and you sacrifice relationships for this greater purpose. And that's very common in cults. But it's where a lot of that, I can see where a lot of abuse or neglect would end up occurring. And then you grow up I grew up like we're raised to be good, to become members of the Sea Org. That's just always what we were going to do and work for Scientology. And you start believing that the only value you have is what you can bring to the group and what you can do. There's no unconditional love and no unconditional acceptance, no compassion, none of that. It's just very black and white.
And it's really interesting again and paradoxical from, okay, Scientology claiming to heal the world, but they're inherently instilling antithetical practices that are against healing the world because they're not, like you said, operating on some of these basic needs that we have. And as I was hearing, when I was listening to you say that too, it's interesting because it's clearly a highly capitalistic, and in a sense, and paradoxically enough, a kind of caricature of communism, which Hubbard hated. And it's like, we must produce, and then just being in that kind of like drone state. And then you are just based on what you can contribute to the group.
Yeah.
That is inherently fascinating and incredibly self-destructive, right? Because then, you see yourself as, maybe in relationships. Okay, I'm only as good as what I can give to this other person.
Yeah.
And that's a very damaging stance to be from.
Yeah.
To operate from, of I'm only good if I can give. And then again, we can draw probably some arrows into, maybe being in some relationships that are unhealthy, right? Either, it's like, oh, so from the beginning, they're robbing people from establishing our natural attachments, it sounds like, and taking care of these needs and destroying the part of us that makes us human.
Exactly, because that is the whole idea. You can't do what your job is in the Sea organization and that level of focus if you had relationships outside of that. You can't get too close to someone. You can't be honest about your real thoughts because you'll get in trouble. They'll report you. There's snitch culture. L. Ron Hubbard said that if you are aware of somebody breaking the rules and you don't report them, you will be found guilty of that.
this is another thing too that you mentioned, going back to kind of like psychosis and the destruction of healthy relationships and these kind of things. Suspicious, high people being high on the trait of suspiciousness is, it can be psychotic. When you, like, so for example, if you're literally suspicious of everyone and constantly looking over your shoulder and constantly, like, it can get psychotic really quickly. So it's like these behaviors are inherently instilling, we could call like pseudo psychosis within people.
Oh
So
my God,
again,
yes.
so that study, I'd be really interested to see that study that was mentioned about, the 25 times, the psychosis rate is like 24 times
it was
higher.
it was just a survey that was done
Yeah.
here on YouTube. But in fact, I can send you the link. Powerlize to Paralyze is the channel, and he
Okay.
put it up there. But
Yeah.
it was based on these surveys that former Scientologists answered. And
Interesting.
the result even shocked me. I was like, I knew it was bad. I didn't know it was that bad, because not only throughout our suffering, we had to act like nothing was wrong. We had to show that, no, everything is great. And of course, we're on board with this. So you couldn't even talk about the negative feelings or emotions that you were having, or there was no, like, I remember as an adult, I just thought, I was talking to my sister and I said, I don't really barely recall any hugs or physical
Mm,
affection growing up. And I just assumed that mom was giving you all the hugs. And she's like,
mm,
no.
mhm. Yeah.
It just wasn't, there wasn't a lot of that, physical touch. In fact, some years ago, so my sister left Scientology before I did, and she got into therapy. And
Okay.
after I left Scientology, probably about maybe 5 years or so after, my sister came to me and she said, "I'm going to start hugging you when
Wow.
we see each other, when we leave." And I was like, "What?" Now, I would hug my children and my
Mm,
partner, and if I didn't see a friend of mine, I would hug them. Like,
mhm.
I'm also from Hawaii, so there's this constant conflicting thing of, like, Scientology be a robot, and then my upbringing and my culture of being loving and accepting, and they were constantly at odds.
Yeah. Yeah, I can see that like how that would be like really confusing of like, wait a
Mhm.
minute, what am I supposed to do here? And again, kind of just speaking like clearly these are like natural inclinations, right? Like you hugged your children. Like for
Yeah,
your parents, adults, we can kind of be like, no, don't hug me, kind of like doing that. But it's like you still had this need. Like I'm gonna imagine, when your daughter was born or your children were born, like you hugged them, you cradled them, and just kind of like a
yeah,
basic biological thing that
yep.
we have that helps form these relationships, these attachment bonds. And the other thing too, it's like obviously Hubbard didn't really care to believe of like what human beings actually are. He wanted us to be this weird kind of image thing that he thought. But humans, we are social creatures. The Stoics, the ancient Stoics, they weren't emotionless people that get kind of portrayed nowadays. Stoics believed that virtue was the only thing that mattered, that being a good person, character, using prudence or practical wisdom, temperance, and these kind of things. And we use them because we're social animals and we're here to help other people. But like that is
Mhm.
fundamentally like, and if you just even look at the biological research, psychological research, we are here for other people and to use our reasoning, right? And it's just interesting to me. Again, I go back to the contradiction between Hubbard saying that, yep, we're going to help people and be all this great, but actively doing things that destroy the very nature of what it means to be a human is really fascinating.
Mhm. Yeah, that was definitely something that was such a contradiction. But again, one that you just didn't give too much thought to. But even being 15 years out of Scientology, there are things all the time that I look at and go, wow, I've come very far. You physically leave a cult like Scientology, but you don't. Getting rid of that mindset, I think, takes a long time. And there's been some cult experts who have said that Scientology is the most difficult cult to recover from, that it takes an average of 12 and a half years, that it takes 3 to 4 times longer to deprogram somebody from Scientology than the Moonies or another cult. It is very insidious. And the more I learn about it outside of Scientology, the more it blows my mind that I am amazed. I get this question a lot. People very nicely, in so many words, say, how are you putting one foot in front of the other?
And this is an interesting point, though, too, of my students and I, we were talking about human development a few weeks ago. And again, this is why, like, we talked about forming social bonds and all these kind of things. But the other thing that we talked about, going back to, like, how are you not broken and shattered in pieces? There is another part. There's an important part of human beings. We are more resilient than we give ourselves credit for. Like, human beings, we do tend to be able to somewhat bounce back, obviously, depending on various factors, right? But it's like we can go through a lot of things and still move forward, still find purpose, still put one foot in front of the other. And again, my hat's off to you for all the things that you've been through, and then to be like, I'm gonna get out, and not only to get out, but then want to help other people. Like, to me, like, that was,
yeah.
And you're reaching, all these people. I again, my hat's off to you.
There are so many people who spoke out before me when I had my doubts and I was making my plan to leave, who were online sharing their stories that made it more possible for me to leave, because a big belief in what they convince you of in Scientology is you're the only one who's thinking that. That if you have doubts about Scientology, you are committing harmful acts. You are a criminal. If you are critical of Scientology, they say everybody who is critical of Scientology is a criminal. You just need to find and expose their crimes. And Scientology will take it a step further and even has a long history of framing people or trying to set them up. They're very good at manipulation and pushing buttons. Are you familiar with the training routines in Scientology? Oh, your students are going to love this one. So in Scientology, there's a thing called training routines. And they start off at there's a children's communication course. Then there's another one. There's a professional one. Throughout your Scientology career, you do hours and hours of these. And it starts out sitting across from another person in the course room. Your feet are on the ground. Your hands are on your lap. You're sitting there. And you're sitting in front of another person. And first you do it with your eyes closed. And you're supposed to do it until you can be there comfortably and confront. You can't move, you can't twitch, nothing. Then the next one you do with your eyes open. So you're sitting across from a person with your eyes open. You're supposed to confront that person and be there comfortably. And as you move up after the beginning course, you have to do this for 2 hours. And if 1 hour and 59 minutes in, you scratch your arm, the clock starts over. You cannot flinch, move, speak, nothing. You just have to sit there comfortably facing your partner, and you're supposed to just completely be present and be there doing that. I think for me personally, it's why I struggle. I can only do a guided meditation. I can't just sit there and meditate. Years of doing this has just made it very uncomfortable. Even like to be in meetings, I struggle with that. If it gets to be it's too long, or I'm like, nope, because we were forced to sit through lectures, and then within my family to just on and on about Scientology and things. So then after you do the 2 hours of facing the person, you do what's called bull baiting. And so say you're the student and I'm the coach. You have to sit there just like you were. I can say and do anything to you but touch you. I can't touch you. And if you laugh, if you get angry, if you react at all, I say flunk. And then I do whatever the action is I did over and over and over again until you no longer react. They do this. They did this with us from the time I was 8 years old. We were children. So you grow up being being able to desensitize yourself to almost anything. They told us it was so that we could confront and deal with things. From your perspective as a psychologist, what is your
Mhm.
insight into that?
That's really interesting because on one level, again, kind of going back to like PTSD and treatment, so it's what we call exposure, right? And there's a range of exposure and there's a range of these kind of things, but we're not doing it to inoculate people. Like we're only doing exposure after a traumatic event or something like that, right? So like to me, I'm just picturing a group of children and just being, you know, whatever that they flunked for, and just like reading, like to me,
Yeah.
that just on the face of it, that seems really sadistic, right?
Oh,
And
yeah.
like really evil to like do that to a child and then like force another child to do it to another child.
Yeah.
So again, I think someone mentioned in the comment, you had mentioned it, it really does drive in this desensitization, you know, doing those kind of things over and over. So L. Ron Hubbard might have been like, yeah, like we're trying to prepare you for this. I don't think you're really preparing anybody for anything. You're just destroying them. Like it's not like you're giving them the psychological backpack full of tools to be able to confront their problems and building up resiliency, which we know how you can do that, fostering good relationships, you know, eating while doing these kind of things, kind of doing it the really wrong way and doing it. And again, long-term, more harmful kind of effects. That's like really, again, not in line with the psychological science at all, as far as like how to develop resilience in people. Like,
Yeah.
That's mind-blowing. That's mind-blowing.
It ended up being the go-to state of mind at times. And I'll give you an example. My sister was in the Sea organization from the age of 14. And when she was 16, she was working on a project and there were a bunch of Sea Org members in the room. They were actually getting things ready for the IRS. It was right before Scientology got their tax exempt status. Some years before, they were being audited or something. So it was going through all these files, and every organization had to send people to work on this project. Everybody went to dinner. My sister was just finishing up what she was finishing. Again, she was 16 years old. She hadn't lived with family for 2 years, hadn't been in school. And a guy came up behind her who worked for the Office of Special Affairs, which is Scientology's dirty tricks branch. And she said, she actually shared this story on my channel because I've had her on multiple times. And I learned about this for the first time when she told the story. My sister keeps doing this to me because we don't sit around and necessarily talk about this. We do more now that I've been on YouTube. So she's telling the story. She said the guy comes up behind her when everybody had left, and he put his hands around her neck, and he just started squeezing. And she said it's like she went right into that state, like of just like not reacting, like doing the training routines. She said she could feel herself almost passing out. And then he stopped and he let out this really creepy sigh and he walked out. She didn't report it. She didn't say anything. She didn't tell me for another, what was that, 35 years? Or I'm not doing the math right, but for a long time.
Yeah. And that gentleman's behavior is like kind of clearly psychopathic, like sadistic, right? Harming someone. And for some people, like there's the sexual part, right? Of like choking someone until they almost pass out, right? But it's interesting, again, going back to breaking down our natural reactions. So then someone in power can then abuse you because in a way, it's called learned helplessness. This is a psychological phenomena of the original study was done with dogs. Martin Seligman, who was once the president of APA and kind of like the father of positive psychology, back in the 70s, he did this study of learned helplessness where he placed these dogs in cages, and the floor of the cage was like a metal grate, and it could be electrocuted, so the dogs could get shocked. And he would put them in these cages, and what they would do is they would no longer like react, right?
Mm-hmm.
But then he would put them in cages where all they had to do was step on another platform that was not electrocutable, right? It was just another area of the floor. They could escape the shock. They didn't. They just laid down. The dogs learned to be helpless. And so some of the stuff that you're describing right here, again, why if we expose you to really mean, nasty things, you get habituated, you get used to it,
Mm-hmm.
and then you can have people in position of power do those things. They're indoctrinating victimization, right? They're indoctrinating learned helplessness.
Yeah,
And
makes sense.
I
think that's why they did it. I mean, I think that's why I could see now, knowing what I know about L. Ron Hubbard, I completely can see that. And I just saw it time and time again where no one reacted the way they should react to things, especially those of us raised in Scientology. And that's something that is difficult. I think it's one of the people are at different parts in their healing with that, but I find often too, it's like, I really need to look at something and make sure that I'm really hearing it, seeing it, experiencing it. And I'm not just, doing this to it. Cause I'm also really good at compartmentalizing things. And in my, since coming out of Scientology, I try more now, like, okay, let's unpack this. Let's deal with this. Let's talk about it. But it is a tool in Scientology. I can see how they use that to indoctrinate us to become these robots, especially in the C organization. Like, we're so desensitized, and we all grew up believing that our value was what we could give to the group, that we end up, a lot of us, developing these work ethics that are way over the top to a point of being unhealthy. And for a lot of us, like for me, sometimes it's a good thing if I don't make my bed, like, or if I don't do something, because it's too much. I know that lately, these last few years, my partner went through cancer treatment for like 3 years, and he passed away last year.
I'm sorry.
And it just made me just like have to drop every ball in my life and then rebuild.
Mm-hmm.
But in doing that, I've been thinking like, okay, I want to be very conscious of, like, my entire life ended and I'm starting a new life. I don't need to go back or have it be maybe some of those habits I was still holding on to because of Scientology. And one of those was the amount that I worked. And for a long time, I needed to work multiple jobs for as long as I did because Tony was so sick and he couldn't work. And I was the only one, supporting us. Yeah. But the interesting thing is, it's like, now I'm realizing it doesn't need to be that way. Like, we don't have to work at that level. Everything doesn't have to be straight up and vertical, like, on a graph. Yeah. That's how you're indoctrinated. Like, that's how it had to be. Yeah. And do things just for fun, not because it resulted in some big accomplishment or a statistic, but just because you enjoy it was something I had to learn that I didn't learn until I met my partner 2 years after leaving Scientology. And it took me probably like 8-9 years of being with him, and him saying, because I would be like, well, because he would say, let's go do this thing. And I'm like, well, why do you want to do that? Because it'd be fun. I'm like, yeah, but why? And because I kept looking for, what's the product? Can you sell it? What's the thing? What's the thing? And he's like, no, it feels good. And I just want to do it. And then I started to learn that, we can do things just because it feels good and we want to do it. It doesn't need to be so tied into production.
Yeah. Yeah. That again too is like, and that seems like wisdom that you learned, right? Of like, okay, where can I separate? Because again, right, working, like, human beings, we are meant to do. I don't necessarily mean work, but there's clearly something within us. Some people refer to it as like, we're meant to do projects, if you will, whatever you want to conceptualize that in. So that's good. But then you get into this routine of like, that is your whole identity. Again, like that can be clearly destructive, and not even connecting on an emotional level of, I just want to do this because I want to. Because again, I'm gonna assume you didn't have the freedom to do stuff just because you wanted to.
Yeah, no, there was no. In fact, Ethan's got a great question related to that. How much free will do you have in Scientology? How much of your day is free time and structured? Well, it depends again on where you fall into. Are you a public Scientologist? You would have more time, but there is pressure that you show up for a minimum of 2.5 hours a day for your Scientology studies. And on top of that, they want you volunteering, selling Dianetics books, things like that. If you're a staff member, you're working full time for Scientology and often another job so you can pay your bills. A Sea Org member works 24/7, 7 days a week. I still to this day, if I read a book in the afternoon, I think it's the most amazing thing ever. Because doing activities that are my own choosing, because even after I left Scientology, and my work ethic has gotten me very far.
Mm-hmm.
But at the same time, I missed a lot. And that's kind of what I'm doing now. I'm finding that I'm not so much focused. I'm simplifying my life. I'm doing things to lower expenses. Like I don't want to work at that level anymore. I'm 54 years old. I'm tired.
Yes.
I raised
Yeah.
5 kids, my 3 and my partner Tony, he had 2.
Okay.
I'm like, I'm exhausted.
Yeah. Yeah. And again, too, it's like, if we look at things as like adaptive versus maladaptive, right? Having drive, whatever you want to call that, and like being hard work, like those can be good things, right?
Yeah.
But again, working 24/7, we just aren't built to sustain that. It's not possible, right? Or it does not lead to optimal functioning. Human beings, we need play, we need fun, we need relaxation. Like if you don't have those, our bodies start to deteriorate. It's not good for us.
Very much so. Mock here says that fun and joy is a purpose for doing something. Leisure is part of productivity because it helps you stay focused and productive to relax. And I agree with that so much. And that's something that myself and many others had to learn, that you can just relax. It doesn't need to have a purpose. Not everything has to have this big purpose like it did in Scientology, just doing something because you enjoy it. Or one of my favorite things to do these days is to sit at a window in my house and stare out the window. Like that is it.
Yeah.
Sometimes I'm listening to music, but it's amazing.
Yeah. Yeah. Just kind of unplug, unwind, and just be a part of nature. And again, kind of like what I think we should do more of. I wanted to ask you, Natalie, I'm curious, what do you really want people to know about Scientology, about your story, about getting just anything? I don't know. I've just been thinking about this as like, you have a message, you have something like what is it? It could even be, what is your takeaway message, for my students or something like that. I'm curious.
I think for me, it's that Scientology is not like other religions. I sometimes hear this comment when people say, well, people are free to choose. Yeah, they are. You are. This is not about a freedom of belief. This is about an organization that has abusive practices that go back to day one, that has taken advantage of people financially, spiritually, mentally. It has caused so much damage that any good actually done by Scientology, I mean, because even a blind squirrel finds a nut, right? A lot of the things, for one, were not Scientology. L. Ron Hubbard stole it from someplace else, and you can learn it through therapy or other self-help. This is an organization that is downright damaging and harmful to individual people. And it's the type of damaging that spans generations. I had 3 generations of my family leave when I left Scientology. My mother, myself, and my daughter, who was an adult by them. And this is not an organization that lets you just walk away. They try to convince you that you need to leave properly, which basically means don't leave. Try and go through our reprogramming so that you stay. And Scientology is shrinking because they're a cult and people are catching on to that. And the big difference today, in all of the years where people have been speaking out about Scientology, have testified, have given firsthand accounts of the most horrific things you've ever heard about. Yet Scientology still stands today. Yet Scientology still has their tax exempt status. That is a huge problem. And Scientology losing their tax exempt status would go a long way in stopping their abuses, because they're hiding behind religion and the acknowledgement they got from the IRS. What they also do in Scientology, every time you do a course or a service, you sign these arbitration forms, agreements, where you're basically saying, I'm not going to sue Scientology. I will subject myself to arbitration within Scientology, with Scientologists deciding what happens and doesn't happen. There is a case right now going on. There's a woman named Valerie Haney. She was a member of the Sea Organization. She worked at the international base in California with David Miscavige, the leader of Scientology. She escaped from that base, and that base has fencing with sharp barbs that point inside, not just outside. It's not keeping people out. It's to stop people from also leaving. They would do drills called blow drills. Blow in Scientology means to leave without authorization. And they would practice. If someone took off, they would go to train stations, airports, track their credit cards if they had them, to bring them back. This woman, Valerie Haney, escaped in the back of a car of a stranger who was there, because that's where they film a lot of the Scientology commercials and stuff like that. She got in the back of the car all the way to, I think, like Los Angeles. It was like a couple of hours. This guy opened his trunk and out pops this woman. She's got a lawsuit with Scientology, and basically, because of these arbitration agreements, the judge said that they had no choice but to send her to Scientology arbitration, that was her next step to rectify this. So she was basically re-abused again to have to go before a panel of Scientologists who, she's a suppressive person. L. Ron Hubbard said, you can do anything you want to a suppressive person. It's called fair game, to stop them from being critical about Scientology. And there's just the damage, it just compounds. Again, it's generational. So I think that's the biggest thing, is that they understand that this isn't just a choice of people should be allowed to believe what they believe. I agree. And I don't even care if Scientologists want to believe in a galactic overlord named Xenu. Knock yourself 100%. Out.
And this again, in hearing these stories, again, I always go back to making sure the public, right, about our perceptions of people who are currently in these cults. It's like, there's that fundamental attribution error, like, oh, I would just leave, or I would do things. We have to remind ourselves of all these systematic pressures, these social pressures that are keeping, they're acting like chains to keep these people stuck. Now, granted, again, yes, you can leave, you can get out, but then again, like your family, do you really want to like leave your family if your family's still in? You ain't got no money. Where you gonna go? What you gonna buy? Right? So like hearing all these stories just makes me think of, it's amazing that like your family, people do leave. And then I just keep going back to these people who are still stuck. And like you said, there's probably some right now watching this. I mean, hopefully there are some people, if they can, that are in Scientology are watching this right now that want to leave. Mm-hmm. And are like feeling stuck. And one of the things I take from your story that I thought was remarkable, planning for 2 years. Mm-hmm. Like, to me, being that meticulous, buying your time, it sounds like towards the end there, they kind of caught on and were like, yeah, something might happen, right? But that, like, I keep thinking of maybe one of the ways is somehow getting some of this information, helping the people who want to get out, helping them kind of formulate their own game plan. And it seems like you've done a lot of that through your channel and those kind of things. And I keep seeing in the comments too for the need help leaving Scientology.
One of the most successful things that, in my opinion, that I did when I was leaving Scientology and when they started, I mean, they sent 2 Sea Organization members, put them on a plane to come to Minnesota just to speak with me, to handle me, because I left the Sea Organization and I was a public Scientologist, but they always see you as a Sea Org member and expect that you're going to just jump to after that. Even though you left, they say, no, you're still always a Sea Org member. And I took the meeting because for me, it was going to be closure. It was like telling the person you were breaking up with, no, we're done. I'm not going back. And I really,
your fault. This was you, not me.
Exactly. This is not me. It's you every day, all day. And I wanted to see kind of the dog and pony show and what they were going to do. And when I met with them, they basically showed me a bunch of L. Ron Hubbard's policy and were pointing out the things that I was violating, and that, I needed to go back to Los Angeles and I needed to handle this properly. And I listened to the whole thing and I'm like, yeah, no, I'm going to pass on that. I'm done with Scientology. And they're like, well, you get declared a suppressive person and all this. And I'm like, well, that's totally fine. I mean, you can do what you're going to do. But when I was leaving, because after that meeting, then the gloves were off for them. That was the last thing they were going to try to do. And after that, they came at me because I was vocal about it. When I was leaving Scientology, I was just going to leave quietly with my family. They wouldn't leave my daughter alone. She had turned 18 while she was in Florida, training to be a staff member here in the Twin Cities. So what took a long time for us to leave was I had to get her back. And they wouldn't let her leave because she was on this training program 24/7, being free labor for them, being sleep deprived, being food deprived as punishment for not making targets that she should have never had, along with everybody else training there. And I knew she had this trip to Mexico with my ex-husband. And so I worked with him because he had left Scientology, but was quiet about it because he had family still in. And we had this whole plan. I mean, I had to get a burner phone, send it to her. I had another family member pick her up. She didn't even know when she was leaving. And at the last minute, they weren't going to let her leave Clearwater because they were kind of catching on. So I had my former husband call. We did a good cop, bad cop. I said, you call and start threatening. And then I'm going to call and say, I'm trying to handle you. And so I was like, you know what? He's been out of Scientology for a long time. I'm going to do my best, but the tickets are bought. She needs to go. And I got her out of there, got her to Mexico. Well, told her when she came, you're not going back. I got you a one-way ticket. I lied to her. I sent her a whole nother itinerary because she wouldn't have left. She was brainwashed.
Yeah.
And I basically used Scientology against Scientology because I knew the rules. So it's so crazy to me that they raise people like me in Scientology, give us all of this information about Scientology, train us to withstand all kinds of abuse, and then think we're not going to turn the table and not be afraid.
They are playing a dangerous game. Like they've told you the rules. Like,
exactly.
Here are all the things, and then it's like,
yeah,
like I mean, again, I'm happy that they do, because then, like, when you get out, you can, again, tell people how this stuff is actually happening.
Yeah, exactly. And like, I knew that if I took certain actions, it would disqualify her from being allowed in Florida again at the Scientology base. So I took those actions. I had to threaten to sue them. I sent certified letters to David Miscavige, the Religious Technology Center. And that's exactly what I threatened. You don't back off. This is what I'm doing. And I was prepared to do it, but I also knew they'd back off. It's basically, you got to flex when it comes to Scientology. When they've sent PIs after me, I'm like, bring it.
Well, I was telling
what are you going to do?
exactly, because it's like, if you hit Yeah, it's like, okay, follow me. Or if you strike me, that's assault. I'm going to call the police, right? Like I don't, well, and I was telling my students the video that I watched of you, recounting your experience, and you said one of the people following you looked like Hulk Hogan or something, like kind of like a big scary guy and stuff. But it's like, he's not going to do anything. Like you're in a public place. Like, I mean, it's an intimidation tactic. Now, granted, we should always be cautious in those kind of things and be like, hey, like, don't follow me or whatever. But it's like, come on, just let's be done. I wanted to say another thing that I was thinking about, because my mind keeps going to the people that are still in my mind ever since, like, I heard you and like talking about leaving and like how can we help people leave. I keep going back to, I'm wondering if when people are still in, I'm gonna take a guess that a lot of people feel maybe a lot of shame and guilt of like this is my fault, right? Like, or like say if they joined later or whatever, and you get a lot of that shame and guilt. And I think those emotions, on top of Scientology's tricks, those emotions, I wonder if are also weighing people down, chaining people down. So I'm wondering for people who are in that position, is if they can give themselves some grace, give themselves some, this wasn't all my fault. Yes, like we make choice, whatever. But give yourself that grace to then be able to get out. Like if that's the last thing holding you back, give yourself that peace, give yourself that grace, and then, doing whatever else you can. That's where my mind just keeps going. So I guess if I'm speaking to anybody out there still in, it's like, and I also heard you say too, I was also really touched. In one of your videos, you said, I'm really appreciative for all the viewers. These people, in Scientology, they tell us the outside world, everybody's bad and whatever. She's like, you were saying, like, everybody's been super, super helpful. Like people want to help, people want to support. It's getting connected with that, finding those people, which can be kind of difficult. But there are people here. There are people that want to help. So again, I kind of go back to that too, of like, it is possible, I guess is what I'm saying. And obviously easier said than done, but you, again, I'm really impressed with you. You just blow my mind of like, you're this strong, incredible person. You and all these other people that are helping these people, leave this group of suffering, if you will.
They use the shame too. What they try to do when you're leaving and they know you're leaving is they try to basically mess you up as much as they possibly can. When I wanted to leave the Sea organization and my sexual assault occurred, they cut me a deal and said, if you never speak about this, we'll let you leave the Sea Org. You won't have to do the long routing form. You won't have to do the security checks. You won't have to do anything. You can just walk out the door. But you could never talk about it. You could never tell anybody what happened. And I took that deal. I just wanted to leave. I had just been assaulted. I was so messed up by that. I was still in shock. And, they convinced me that it was my fault because there's a lot of victim blaming in Scientology. I must have done something to pull it in. They asked me questions like, what were you wearing? Were you flirting with him? Was there like a vibe? They call it 2D flowing. And then because you are not allowed to be a victim in Scientology, that's the worst thing you can possibly be. They made up a whole story because I was living in Seattle at the time. And I told them, well, I'll move to Minnesota. My mom's there. I'll start over. I just want to take my kids and go. And my mom was in Scientology. So they said, okay. But what I found out they told everyone in Seattle is that I had cheated on my husband. And that's why we were splitting and I was moving to Minnesota. So, but here's the thing. I never even corrected it because my mindset then is I rather be seen as a whore than a victim. That was my mentality then. And when I got to the point years later, when I realized that assault was not my fault, that was start of the beginning of the, wait a minute. And I had, if you watch, I don't know how much of my earlier story you saw, but I was in a mall shooting, and
Yeah.
it was in the mall while I was hiding that I realized I need to leave Scientology. I don't care anymore. Take my whole family. As long as I can take my children, I'm out. And that's what started my whole plan. And it took 2 years because I had to get my daughter back because she had turned 18. They would have sent her anywhere to get her away from me. And she was brainwashed enough that she would have probably done that. You know, we had to get her some sleep and some good food. And then in talking to her, it took weeks, but eventually she came around and was like, okay, yeah, I'm seeing this now. And she left as well and then wasn't going to go back.
And it's like too of like, despite everything, all these tricks, mind games that they use, again, I kind of go back to like, we are still resilient. Like they like with your daughter, she still came and she was able to see, like once she got away from it. And today in class, actually, my students and I, when we were talking about like stress and emotions and stuff, like we get this tunnel vision. And like if we're feeling depressed, we kind of look down this tunnel, or anxious, we look down this tunnel and we forget about all this other stuff that happens in our lives and we focus on the single problem. But once you can step back from that or try to look, at your perspective, then you can see, oh, yeah, this is some crazy stuff. Like, this is harmful, right? But while you're in it, I can see again that keeping the blinders on. I think you used that, term earlier.
Yeah, very much so. That's totally how it goes. You know what I think would be fun? We should do this again, and I'm going to put together a bunch of L. Ron Hubbard policy and Scientologies, and I would love for you to react to it.
All right. I can do that. 100%. That'd be fun.
Put a 1 in the chat if you guys are down for that. Put a 1 in the chat. We'll do another video and we'll have Jordan, as somebody with this huge background in psychology, react to some Scientology. And you can go ahead and I'll start making a list. I'll go through, and if you guys want to email me, Natalie@lifeafteraccult.com, with any specific things you want me to ask Jordan about, we can talk about that too. Oh, good. We're getting a lot of ones. So yeah. I think that would be fun because I know just in talking to you tonight, you're bringing a lot of like what should have happened, what it actually is. And I think that's something that's been missing, because even you go and you leave Scientology and we go through our own, like we might do our own therapy, but it's not just being done out here in the open where people can talk about it. But I think having you react to some of these basic Scientology practices would be a good way. I feel like that would help with some of the unbrainwashing.
Yes. Yeah, no, I would love to be back and do that. Whatever. Again, whatever I can do to be helpful, I guess. Again, I try to be helpful. And yeah, whatever. Any other questions or, whatever, I'm game.
Yeah, well, let's do it. When we log off here, then when I end this stream, stick around because you'll be in the back end, and then we'll set up a time to do that. So that's what we'll do. It looks like you guys are all down for it. Lots of ones there. I think we'll absolutely do this again. And I thank you so much for being here. And thank you to your students who joined. I hope you guys have a great conversation about this tomorrow or in your coming classes. And any questions that you have, bring those as well. And you can always shoot them to me anytime too.
Awesome. Thank you very much for having me. I appreciate it. I'm honored that you guys, wanted to hear what I have to say, that you cared. And this was a great conversation. Hopefully it was helpful for people. Students, remember, do your extra credit assignment if you want some extra credit.
That's right. And like and subscribe.
Like and subscribe is part of the deal. Natalie says, like and subscribe. Awesome.
All right, perfect. Jordan, you hang on for a minute. Everybody else, thank you for being here so much. I will see you guys tomorrow. I am going to do a recap, 9 a.m. Central. I hope y'all have an amazing cult-free evening.